A billionaire comes to you and says, listen, I want to bring back the dinosaurs. How the hell do you bring a woolly mammoth back? What does it mean to de-extinguish a woolly mammoth in the first place?
We're not trying to clone these animals. We are de-extincting lost genes that produce these physical attributes that no longer exist in that species.
You're bringing back an extinct species after having been in AI and software coding and such.
We believe we'll have our first calves by early 2028. We are on track for that.
This is the technology that can bring back extinct animals. But then you come in as a for-profit entrepreneur and go from zero to, the numbers still blow me away, to 225 million in a couple of years.
I think I'm insatiably curious, right? And I like to learn.
This is the difference that the right CEO and entrepreneur can make for a moonshot. On this episode of Moonshots and Mindsets, I'll be speaking with Ben Lamm, an extraordinary CEO whose moonshot it is to bring back animals who are extinct. We'll hear about which animals he's bringing back, what his timeline is, how he raised $225 million at a $1.5 billion valuation to do this in just 2 years' time. It's incredible lessons for any moonshot entrepreneur out there. All right, let's jump in. Everybody, welcome to Moonshots and Mindsets. I'm here with an incredible entrepreneur and a dear friend, someone who blows my mind, and the difference that a single individual can make in taking on a massive moonshot. Ben Lamm, how you doing, buddy?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, no, this is going to be a fun show. First of all, full disclosure, I'm an advisor to this company. Bold Capital is an investor in this company. But then again, I love working with amazing CEOs and those especially taking on great moonshots. Let's begin, Ben Lamm, with what is your moonshot? What is Colossal's moonshot? Because it really is epic.
Yeah, it's restoring the past and for a better future, right? And so fundamentally, Colossal is the world's first de-extinction company focused on de-extincting a couple of core, iconic, charismatic creatures back to the world, and then also building technologies for human healthcare and species preservation and conservation.
And we'll get into those. But I mean, a moonshot of bringing back extinct animals. Years ago, I had this conversation about having an XPRIZE. Like, let's have an XPRIZE to bring back then it was the dodo. But your moonshot here has bridged 3 species, and I may try and squeeze out of you how many more species you're working on. But it's pretty awesome. I mean, as they would say, what could possibly go wrong? But let's get to that a little bit later. So a moonshot of bringing back extinct animals. Let's start with the origin, right? People who are listening to this who have their own moonshots, which by definition are crazy ideas before an entrepreneur actually makes them real. We're going to talk through the story of where this began, how you've gotten this funded, where it is, what the timeline is, what the difficult parts have been. So you've been an entrepreneur over and over again. Actually, you haven't been an entrepreneur in the biotech industry, this is squarely faced in.
This is a new category for me, right? But it's a systems problem, right? And so whether, my background's been in mostly software, some space hardware, but for the most part software, and most software problems are systems problems. So looking at a challenge or an issue, whether it's AI, whether it's in space or critical infrastructure or even a video game, and looking at building a system. And weirdly enough, de-extinction is a systems problem. You have to build and take a systems mindset to solving it.
So it didn't scare you to go after this, even though you had no biological background? I mean, you probably knew what DNA was and RNA, but you're bringing back an extinct species after having been in AI and software coding and such. But let's get to that. First, let's go to the origin story here. So, I mean, you weren't just walking around thinking about bringing back the woolly mammoth, which is your iconic first species. How did this get going?
Well, I think I'm insatiably curious, right? And I like to learn, and I've always just done a great job, I think, of surrounding myself with much smarter, women and men than me to work on these projects, right? Like in my last business, like I didn't build any software that went into satellites, right? Like I had incredible teams to do it. I knew how to, help them and help, inspire them and direct them on where we should go. But fundamentally, it was them that did the incredible work. And I called George because I was really interested on the intersection.
Which George?
George Church, arguably the father of synthetic biology, and I would argue one of the smartest people on the planet, but actually one of the funniest. And so George, so you get this, but like a lot of people just look up to George as this incredible industry titan and kind of leader in the field of genomics and kind of like father of synthetic biology.
Sort of a godlike figure with a beard and the hair to match. He looks like Moses.
He looks like that, but he's also like amazingly funny. And so I reached out to George because I was very curious and I wanted to know where AI, where automation, where opportunities could lie in the intersection of software and synthetic biology and kind of this next revolution that I thought was coming. And that conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. And then I'm curious, and I have George Church on the phone, and I was like, well, what else are you working on? And he started to tell me all these other things that he was working on in this incredible labs, working on in everything from kind of like neural regeneration to combating climate change to food security. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like the chocolate factory of innovation and amazingness. And then he kind of ended the call with, and I'm working to bring back woolly mammoths to restore the degraded ecosystem of the tundra and also build technologies to help elephants and maybe other extinct species. And then he was like, I have to go to my next meeting. And I was like, you just dropped this most amazing thing on me ever. And so I stayed up all night and then I was like, it was kind of like the end of like, Signs or The Sixth Sense, where you have this like M. Night Shyamalan moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, like every article I'd read about George, I didn't see this through line of the mammoth. But then when I went back and started reading and listening to podcasts, I just saw how there was this through line, no matter what he was talking about, the mammoth kept surfacing. And a week later, I was in his lab and I was like, I have to go pursue this.
Amazing. So those who don't know George Church, he's a professor of genomics at Harvard. He has probably started 50 plus companies and has a dozen unicorns, a number of them public. I mean, he's one of the most prolific entrepreneurs and one of the sweetest, good-hearted individuals on the planet.
He's amazing. And I feel insanely lucky to be co-founded with him, but I think I do monopolize probably more of his time because he is so excited. Yeah.
This is an important point for entrepreneurs out there who are looking at their moonshots. You brought a set of skills to this as a great CEO, as a systems thinker, as an entrepreneur, but not having the biological background didn't scare you off.
No, it did scare early investors off. Like, I think it was like your text and like a handful of others that inspired me. But like we talked to some folks now that we have great relationships with, I won't say who, that did not invest early. And their early feedback was like, you don't have a postdoc from George's lab. You have zero science people on the team at the time that we put this deck together. And they're like, you actually haven't even signed a research agreement with George's lab or Harvard. And we're like, yeah, but we're going to figure all that out.
There was a lot of insert miracle, believe in Ben here type stuff early on. I remember that. I want to give people just to jump ahead a little bit, because to understand how epic you are and this company is. So you meet George in 2019?
We met first in 2019, and then there was we kept emailing because there was a small pandemic that took up a lot of our 2020.
I'll never forget having George was speaking to my Abundance Platinum group over video during the pandemic. And he's like, yeah, I manufactured my own vaccine and I took it myself in the lab. That's George.
He did. He showed up once on Zoom because we weren't working on Colossal during 2020, but he showed up once on Zoom with this like helmet on that had like these like filtration things. And he's like, I'm just testing this out, but you should buy one. I think I actually did.
So 2019, you meet with them, you start incubating this conversation. Colossal as a company starts when?
2021. So
2021.
about May of 2021, I decided I want to go do this. I want to do this full time. I brought in a new CEO, and it was hard for me, right? Because I'd never let go of the reins of a company I was running.
So you were running what company at that time?
I was running Hypergiant, which was an AI company focused on critical infrastructure, space, and defense. And I brought in, we're 150, 160 people working with the U.S. government and a couple other big companies. And I had to hand that over, to a new CEO, which was great. And the guy in Mike's did a great job taking over that. And so I recruited a guy that I'd known for 10 years to take over. And I think everyone thought I was a little nuts because I was like, yeah, I'm going to go work on this woolly mammoth company. But it's definitely not competitive.
No, it's not. So that's 2021, a couple of years ago. And today, just for people to understand the epic journey that Ben has been on, Ben has raised how much money at what valuation, Ben?
So we've raised $225 million to date. The valuation right now post is around $1.5 billion. We have 4 labs, including one in Australia. And we have 112 full-time people, with about 90% of those people being scientists. And then we fund 30 postdocs around the world in our advisors' labs, and we have about 60 scientific advisors.
All right. So, that's the right back at you to those who didn't invest early on. I mean,
they were fair. I mean, but in fairness, it's
it was a crazy moonshot.
Moonshot, no. Yeah. And look, we I do believe that animals may be coming sooner than people think, but we don't have a mammoth now. So, for their sake, they're probably like, we haven't seen a mammoth yet either. And so,
but I just want, what's extraordinary, because I'm in the venture business through Bold, which is one of the investors in the last couple of rounds. And I work on getting my own companies funded. And while you're out there raising, your last round, 150 million or thereabouts at a 1.3, 1.4 billion pre-money. Everybody else is having a hell of for a de-extinction company. Everybody else is having a hell of a time, raising money for a normal company. And I just want to point out, this is the extraordinary power of an amazing CEO. And I've said this to you before, Ben. And George agrees with you. You're one of the best CEOs I've seen out there, and I'm going to want to sort of analyze that a little bit of what you think makes you successful in this realm. But we'll get to that. So, de-extinction company. You start off with a woolly mammoth. How the hell do you bring a woolly mammoth back? What does it mean to de-extinguish a woolly mammoth in the first place?
Yeah, so we're not trying to clone these animals, which I think is a really important, distinction, because we don't have living cells. We have frozen cells, and we've got, dead cells, and we can do the genomic sequencing, but it's massively fragmented DNA. So we actually have to assemble a genome and then compare it to a reference genome to kind of fill in those gaps from its closest living relative. In the case of the mammoth, that's the Asian elephant.
Right,
so there's a lot of software.
So George has been on a multitude of expeditions into the tundras of what countries?
Siberia, into Siberia, and actually extracted DNA from frozen mammoth tissues with Ariana Husili, our head of biological sciences here at Colossal.
So you go and you're digging and you find these giant tusks, and you find this hairy, large elephant. And where's the DNA? Is it in the hair follicles, in the skin? Is there like a dead mosquito in amber someplace that you're trying to?
Yeah, you cannot get, the question comes up quite a bit. Amber is very porous, and it does not preserve. The 2 biggest questions we had: we cannot get DNA from mosquitoes or anything in amber, and we can't get anything from the La Brea tar pits, because heat and acid's also not good for ancient DNA preservation. But mostly in tusk and in teeth. Those are 2 places where the DNA is very well preserved and it's mostly endogenous DNA versus it hasn't been, corrupted by, like, on the flesh and whatnot, even that the part that's fleshy, that's been corrupted by like microbes and bacteria and other things over the last like 5,000 years.
And so when you go and you grab the DNA from this animal that's now, typically 10,000 years old?
Yeah, most are about 10,000 years old.
Are you able to get a single continuous sequence?
You aren't. So you get fragments. It's kind of like confetti. And then you have to get these short reads. There's a couple of kind of decent long reads out there. And what's amazing about this is, for us to build our reference genome for the mammoth, we actually had to use 54 mammoth genomes. Some of those we got that were published by other great researchers. Some of those were from George. And then one of those, we have a great partnership with Luva Dahlin at the University of Stockholm, who's arguably one of the number one, he's not a geneticist, but he's one of the number one people in the world that just looks at mammoths and studying mammoths and their DNA. And so building this like international coalition of collaborators has been really key to the speed at which we've been able to move.
All right. So you get all of these short read segments and they sort of overlap and you're putting them together like a puzzle.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you're comparing it to elephants today. What's the closest living relative to the woolly mammoth?
So the Asian elephant's the closest. It's 99.6% the woolly mammoth genetically. It's actually closer to a mammoth than an Asian elephant is to an African elephant, which sometimes blows my mind that the mammoths were closer genetically than they are to African elephants. But there's no, even though like Asian elephants and African elephants exist today, there was no reference genome. So then we had to go separately and go build a reference genome for those. And then you have to go through like CITES and import permits just to get, because some of these are endangered animals that you have to then go work with and then build a reference genome that then you can compare to. So it's not like we could just go do this and then compare. So then there's a mountain of work just to build the reference genome to compare to.
So you're taking an Asian elephant and you're sequencing it, right? I mean, you can get the blood samples, you can get just like today, you can sequence, a human genome is 3.2 billion letters from your mother and your father. And, back when Craig Venter sequenced his genome, it was $100 million and 9 months to get his genome. And now we have human reference genomes. And I think the number is down to like 7 hours and $200 for a human genome. Pretty amazing.
But that's not, it is amazing. It's not quite, telomere to telomere. Like the reference genomes that we are building for our species are that next level. So, it's more in the, low hundreds of thousands of dollars of work, but, it's not, 50 million or a billion like it was before.
So you've got a reference genome for an Asian elephant that's 99.6% similar to a mammoth. And it's
that African. And we also did African elephant recently too. We just released.
And so your job now is to find that 0.4% and do what? Make the edits in the Asian elephant genome?
Well, it's a great question, but we're not trying to bridge the 4%. What we're really trying to do is understand what were the genes that differed in that 4%. So not trying to bridge that 4% or fill it in, like in Jurassic Park, they were trying to fill in the gaps. We aren't trying to do that. We're just trying to say of that 4% that's different, 0.4% that's different, what were the genes that we could associate with the phenotypes or physical attributes of the woolly mammoth, right? And so, because they lost them in some evolutionary path that rose to Asian elephants, right? So that's like the curved tusk, some of the craniofacial morphology, and then obviously the shaggy coat that we think about. And so really identifying which genes do what in comparison and what's missing and also what's present in the mammoth genome that's not in the Asian elephant genome.
So how many actual phenotypes are you trying to, is there a list like, these are the priorities? Like if we make these changes, we've got a woolly mammoth. But it's not really woolly mammoth. It's close to, it's a facsimile of a woolly mammoth. It's a new...
Yeah, some people have different perspectives on this. Like some people say, well, technically it's a cold-tolerant Asian elephant that's been edited with mammoth alleles to produce phenotypes that were once extinct.
And a hair transplant.
Yeah. We're not going to say any of that. We're just going to say, like for us, if it serves the ecological components of why we're doing it. And if we de-extinct the core genes that make a mammoth, then we just call it a mammoth, right? We may call it the colossal mammoth, Mammoth 2.0. We're still working on like branding nomenclature, but to your point, it's not a direct clone, right? It's not really a hybrid or some people have called it a chimera. It's not a chimera. It is. We are de-extincting lost genes that produce these physical attributes that no longer exist in that species. And so I think that we are. Because of the targeted nature of our approach, it does make it easier than making a million changes. But I think it's also a pretty smart way to think about the engineering efforts versus trying to go overboard. So yeah, there's a list. There's about 5 or 6 core phenotypes that we think you need not only to resemble a mammoth, but also to make cold tolerance at the level that we want.
Amazing. So you make those edits using CRISPR technology?
So what I love right now about the world is that
everybody knows what CRISPR is.
Everyone knows CRISPR. But then it's also become a catch-all, right? So like CRISPR is now like the catch-all for genetic engineering, right? Where people are, as you know, Peter, there's a million different tools. There's recombinases, there's talons, there's CRISPR, there's single nucleotide edits, prime editing, base editing. Like there's all these things, right? And as you pointed out, I'm not a biologist or geneticist, but what I've learned,
you play a damn good one on TV.
So I'm very curious about it. So I try to learn, right? George says the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me, maybe in my life, is that George said I'm one of the best students he's never had. So I'll take that as from George. I think it was a big compliment. So what's interesting is we are using different tools, including CRISPR, based on the need. So in some cases, there are knockouts that are needed where CRISPR is a great fit. Other cases, we're doing base editing where we're changing these individual letters on that kind of DNA ladder. And in some cases, when there's a gene with a lot of edits, we'll actually synthesize that entire piece and then just do a complete swap. So we'll put in a big chunk of DNA, swapping out what's there. And so different species have different needs. We're doing way more DNA swaps on the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine project because there's more genetic divergence than there is on the mammoth project. So there's more edits required to make a thylacine than there is to make a mammoth. And so we have kind of this cluster of tools, including CRISPR, that we're using.
So I find that fascinating. At the end of the day, you're bringing back a woolly mammoth-like species, but it's new. I want to hit on one point that I want everyone listening to hear because it's really important. We already hit on the point that you didn't have the bio background, but you had great experience as an entrepreneur, as a systems thinker, as a fundraiser, as someone who's able to aggregate an amazing team and focus it. What most people don't know is how long has George been working on bringing back the woolly mammoth? When did he first start thinking about this?
So it's been about 10 years. So 9 or 10 years he's been working on it. And the only money he was able, and as you pointed out, he's not out there raising capital. He's out there really innovating. But the only money that went to this was, Peter Thiel, who's not a colossal investor, but Peter Thiel donated $100,000 to George's lab. And so can I tell you one weird, funny story about this? So when I was on the second call with George about the mammoth, and I was talking to George, and I asked the question, which in hindsight it's really funny now, but you'll notice the frame of mind at the time. I was like, George, so now how much money do you need to bring back a mammoth? And he said, well, we've raised 100, and I literally I got sick to my stomach because I was already in love, right? So I literally sat my phone on my desk in my house, put it on speaker because it's George Church, you still got to listen. But I'm like, okay, I guess it would take $100 million. I could see that. I know how technology works. And I was racking my brain, and I was like, can I raise $100 million for this? I've raised $100 million before. Can I do that? And so I went through this, while I'm talking to George, I'm having this existential mini crisis. how do I pull off raising $100 million for Mammoth? And then he's like, yeah. And then that's like, we're doing it over, 10 years. So that's only $10,000 a year. And I was like, wait, I'm so sorry. How much money has been devoted to this? And he's like, $100,000. I was like, how much money do you need to do this in just to get to like an embryo? And he's like, well, there's a lot to it, but he's like, probably, something more like, 20 million. We can make a lot of progress and get really close. And I was like, and then I was like, okay, cool. I can get there, right? I can wrap my brain. Now, ironically, fast forward to today, we have raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll probably raise more money. And so, ironically, my initial fear became my reality later.
So I want to point out, this has been an idea for 9 or 10 years. 100,000 was brought in. There was a nonprofit started by some amazingly good-hearted individuals to try and do this.
Stuart and Ryan, yeah, they're great.
Yeah, Stuart Brand and Ryan. But then you come in as a for-profit entrepreneur and go from zero to, the numbers still blow me away, to 225 million in a couple of years. And the team in place, the technology in place, and so forth. And for folks listening, this is the difference that the right CEO and entrepreneur can make for a moonshot, right? Nothing changed. It wasn't a miracle inserted here. It was the right individual telling the right story. And when you get to the story, because people say, well, what the hell is their business model? What are you going to do? Like a pet woolly mammoth?
I think that, but I do think that passion and conviction is key. And one of the things that I wrestled with is I actually wrestled pretty hard with hypocrisy in this deal, and which I want to explain because I think it's really important. I feel like I can't speak for every entrepreneur, or especially every technology entrepreneur, but I have said 1,000 times probably in fundraising meetings, I want to change the world. I want to make an impact. And as you know, most companies, if they're successful, get acquired or go public or whatever, and they may create great returns and innovate in a field, but not all of them really have a chance to make this lasting impact. And so I felt like I was going to regret it for the rest of my life, and I was going to be a hypocrite to myself if I didn't pursue this, because George Church just served up on a silver platter an opportunity to really build a great, cool business, advance incredible technologies that can help, humankind as well as help conservation. And all I had to do was go try. That's all I had to do. I had to at least go try. And if I didn't do it, like I don't feel like I really had a choice, because I felt like the rest of my life, I'll be like, you're a hypocrite. You can't ever say again that you want to go really try to change the world or make a difference, because you were given the opportunity. This wasn't my idea. This was given to me, and I had to pursue it. I didn't really have a choice.
Amazing. I want to hit on a couple of points here. The environmental side of this, we've talked about this. In fact, we've got a $100 million gigaton carbon removal XPRIZE, and you were saying, we're going to enter a colossal into that. So what is the connection between the woolly mammoth and the environment? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so George and this I think does a great job of teeing into the business model too, right? Because George's original pitch to me, as we kind of like started to peel back the onion, was there's more carbon and more methane stored in the Arctic tundra than anywhere else on the planet. Way more than the rainforest, way more anywhere. And it just piles up year after year. It's about 1.6 trillion metric tons, which is about double what's in the atmosphere. And even more methane, which is about 30 times worse in the atmosphere. So George's thesis, which is proven, I've now been to the Arctic, and I've been with the Army Corps of Engineers in the permafrost tunnels, and actually been inside of the permafrost, not walked above it. And they have shared with me, if this all melts, humanity's in a lot of trouble. And so George's, so this has been a concern of George's for a long time. We talk about this 1.5 degree tipping point, but what's interesting is George teamed up with some incredible folks, Nikita in Siberia, outside of Churchkey, and they created something called Pleistocene Park, where they've actually published in 8 or 10 peer-reviewed papers have come up in scientific journals showing that the reintroduction of cold-tolerant fauna back at the right biodiversity levels and density levels back into the Arctic tundra, and the removal of these low carbon yielding carnivorous trees that have this extremely dark bark. They're not efficient at carbon sequestration. They actually are almost like heat lightning rods that then permeate that. So the removal of the trees, which they've done with bulldozers and tractors, and the reintroduction of these muskox and bison and others, they've actually shown that they've been able to lower ground temperatures by up to 8 degrees and sustain them, which is incredible. In mammoths, and this is going into George's theory, is that mammoths could be an accelerant to that because they're also herding animals. They're also major herbivores. They do a great job of that nitrogen oxygen cycle in the summer months of permeating out the Arctic grasslands. But then in the winter months, they also love to knock down. Elephants are notorious for knocking down trees. There's incredible documentaries and published papers out there showing that they actually in African forest elephants in particular knock down trees that are low carbon yielding. It's so weird. Nature is just amazing. It's incredible. And so that combination, you got these natural bulldozers, you got these natural herbivores, and then their migratory patterns actually help to get rid of that insulation layer in the snow and pack the snow so that the winter months, that cold winter air can actually help get closer to the ground. So it starts at a colder temperature going into the summer months, so less actually thaw. So these
animals are like 12 feet high, 8-ton. Giant animals.
Yeah, they're big. Most people think that when they think woolly mammoths, a lot of times I think people think of the straight-tusked elephant, or they think of the Colombian mammoths and a few of these other species that end up being a little bit bigger. But most of woolly mammoths were about the size of African elephants today, which sounds small, but if you see an African elephant, it's a massive animal.
And they need to be cold tolerant. Which is part of the changes you're making, because you're not going to take an African elephant and move it up there.
So what's interesting about that is we're not just doing the shaggy coat, but we're also doing the subcutaneous fat layer. And then there's other things that are kind of like what we kind of joke internally, they're like beneath the hood that no one actually sees, like Trip B3, and they actually, and it's not just mammoths, but like caribou, polar bears, some wolf species actually have this, where they produce hemoglobin at a different rate and a different ability, so they can actually produce oxygen at sub-freezing temperatures. Like we can't at negative 40, we don't have, our blood crystallizes. We can't breathe at that temperature, but they actually can because of how their hemoglobin works. And the same thing goes for nerve endings. Our nerve endings would just be fried. Their nerve endings are actually different than ours due to some of these genes. So there's under the hood stuff that we're doing, but actually elephants are more temperate than people think. One of our partners in Canada actually has Asian elephants, which people think are just, tropical species. And we've been up there with them, and we have videos of them actually breaking through the ice, swimming in frozen lakes, rolling around in the snow. And those are like sub-freezing temperatures, but those aren't negative 40. But elephants are pretty tolerant species that people don't think of.
So you raised $225 million, a large chunk of it from an amazing investor, entrepreneur, industry magnate, Thomas Tull.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thomas Tull, as well as his fund USIT, are both our largest investors, and we're very, very grateful to Thomas.
And he's in the movie business.
So Thomas is actually a technologist, and know Thomas, so you've met Thomas, but he's most known for Legendary Pictures, which was actually weirdly a movie studio, but it was actually technology driven. So they actually used a lot of technology in terms of people are like, how did Legendary have so many hits? They actually had technology and models around what they wanted to go produce. And so Thomas is very passionate, not just about movies, but also science and technology, and also education. And he does feel that us chronicling this story and sharing it with the world will help educate and inspire the next generation of people that could want to grow up and be a scientist.
I'm super passionate about longevity and health span and how do you add 10, 20 healthy years onto your life. One of the most underappreciated elements is the quality of your sleep. And there's something that changed the quality of my sleep, and this episode is brought to you by that product. It's called 8 Sleep. If you're like me, you probably didn't know that temperature plays a crucial role in the quality of your sleep. Those mornings when you wake up feeling like you barely slept, yeah, temperature is often the culprit. Traditional mattresses trap heat, but your body needs to cool down during sleep and stay cool through the evening, and then heat up in the morning. Enter the pod cover by 8 Sleep. It's the perfect solution to the problem. It fits on any bed, adjusts the temperature on each side of the bed based upon your individual needs. I've been using pod cover and it's a game changer. I'm a big believer in using technology to improve life, and 8 Sleep has done that for me. And it's not just about temperature control. With the pod's sleep and health tracking, I get personalized sleep reports every morning. It's like having a personal sleep coach. So when you eat or drink or go to sleep too late, how it impacts your sleep. So why not experience sleep like never before? Visit www.8sleep.com, that's EIGHTSLEEP.com/moonshots, and you'll save $150 on the pod cover by 8 Sleep. I hope you do it. It's transformed my sleep and will for you as well. Now back to the episode.
I'm going to get back to how in the world do you start at a standing start and raise $225 million for a de-extinction company? Because that in itself is a moonshot. We'll come back to that in a minute. So how far are you from this incredible bringing back the woolly mammoth? Where are we on this journey? What's your time frame? What can you say?
Yeah, so we have successfully achieved induced pluripotent stem cells in elephants, which is a feat in itself, which I can explain why it's interesting. We have narrowed down our gene list to about 65 genes that we're editing. We've established cell lines, and we're in the editing process. So we've already edited about 20 different genes, and we're doing functional assays, ensuring in testing and whatnot. And then the big key thing that we've done from a systems approach perspective is that we've parallel pathed all the different components, right? So, I think a lot of people would have done the computational analysis, then done the gene editing, then wanted to work on creating induced pluripotent stem cells, then worked on somatic cell nuclear transfer. We actually have an entire embryology lab that's just working on cloning in a lot of other non-model organisms out there other than mice and pigs, so that we are the most proficient at it, so that when we have those embryos, we can do that cloning step. And we have an entire animal husbandry team that's working with elephants in Africa and here in the States. And so for us, we're well on our way. We believe we'll have our first calves by early 2028. We are on track for that. The biggest hurdle is it's a 22-month gestation. So, we'll have embryos before.
Moms who are listening to this, imagine carrying your embryo for 22 months, 3 times the length of a typical.
But a thylacine is only 13 and a half days. Isn't that crazy?
So that is insane. 13 and a half. You can barely do anything in 13 and a half days.
But what's crazy is that a thylacine, which is a wolf-size marsupial.
Right, let's come back to that in a moment.
I get excited about the gestational.
Right, so I'm going to put a pin in the woolly mammoth here, and we're going to come back to more of this conversation. But it's not just the woolly mammoth you're bringing back. And I think that's important. This began as a single dream, a single moonshot from George. But once the technology exists and the mindset, and now the capital and the team, there's a lot of extinct animals out there, and people have been aggregating genomes. So I know there's a lot you can't speak about. How many can you speak about?
So we publicly announced we're working on the mammoth, the thylacine, and the dodo. Right, the dodo is our first avian species. We get a lot of people pinging us about all kinds of extinct species.
Couldn't imagine why.
yeah. We get the dinosaur question. We get it all, right? And so for us, those are three massive teams that are focused. And then, we are doing exploratory research on other species. But the biggest thing for us is really kind of combining which species we should do with why we should do it, right? And so there's some cool species that have been brought up to us, and we're like, but why would we ever do that, right? And so what's the impact of that? And there's other people pursuing de-extinction on species that that are great, but they don't have the same kind of impact that we think they should have, so we are not pursuing them.
All right, let's hit the thylacine first.
We can only hit the three, but there may be more in the works.
All right, there are more in the works. You just can't talk about that. What could possibly go wrong? Okay, so the thylacine. So what is a thylacine and 12.5-day gestation period?
Yeah, the thylacine is an extinct marsupial that almost it's called it's also referred to as the Tasmanian tiger or even the Tasmanian wolf because it's a marsupial, but it looks like a wolf. It's an absolutely beautiful animal that went extinct in 1936 in Tasmania, and it was the apex predator of the food chain. It was incredible, and the Australian government actually put bounties on the heads of thylacines and eradicated them. So they were paid to eradicate the species. But unfortunately enough, some of them were preserved in ethanol. And Dr. Andrew Pass, like George, where it was really, his mammoth was the thylacine. And he's worked for the last 15 years on collecting samples and DNA. And now the tools are making it easier in him to kind of assemble that genome.
And the dodo, similar story?
So dodos, okay, so thylacine is another mammal, makes a lot of sense. It's a very similar process. It has easier challenges, 13.5-day gestation versus 22 months. We actually didn't have to assemble the front end of the genome because they got about 92% long read, like incredibly well preserved genome, which is amazing, but a lot
because
more
it went extinct so recently.
Yeah,
and it got
and
well
so
preserved.
Well preserved. Yeah, and so it's almost inverse of the mammoth, right? Because like harder, more editing, more computational analysis, easier genome assembly, and easier gestation, right? And so we loved the thylacine as a bolt as our second species because it was mammalian, same team, same structure, but it was exactly inverse problem set. So we thought we could learn a lot complementary looking at it from kind of that systems lens. The dodo. So the dodo, like we didn't pursue that. This is where, you've got to believe that everything happens on some level for a reason. And what was crazy about the dodo was Beth Shapiro, who's incredible. She's our lead paleogeneticist. She's one of the top ancient DNA experts in the world. She wrote the book.
You hear that, kids? One of your future career options is an ancient paleogeneticist.
Yeah.
God. Crazy.
It's crazy. It's amazing. It's crazy. And she actually has a dodo tattoo, and she had been working, for over 10 years on the dodo genome, been to Mauritius, had worked with museum samples, had been assembling it, comparing it. But once again, massively underfunded. She's very well known, and a lot of her stuff has incredible funding, but this was not a project that was super well funded, but it's something that's really passionate to her. And what was interesting was our investors kind of led the dodo project, where Thomas and Jim Breyer and a few others said, listen, if you are the de-extinction company, the dodo is the face of human-caused extinction, right or wrong. Why are we not doing that? So I talked to Beth. It's very similar in many ways, easier in some, harder in others. It forced us to develop new tools around like primordial germ cells and other things that we didn't have built that we don't need for our other projects. And, we told our investor base, if you guys support us, with the financing, we will pursue it. And we have the subject matter expert in Beth. And so that was one that we were very fortunate from, that it kind of came from the general public and our investors that really kind of helped drive that decision.
Amazing. And just note here, the last widely accepted sighting of the dodo was in 1662.
Yeah.
So
Been
It's
a
been a
while.
few hundred years.
Yeah.
Been a while.
And most people don't think of this. The pictures you see of the dodos, a lot of those are like chicken and turkey feathers. So we're actually doing computational analysis. Like people just think that dodos were like brown or white, and they may have been, but we're actually verifying that the gene, what you see in museums has been, assembled.
Yeah. Human bias comes in there. So people say to me last year when I was bragging about you and bragging about the company and saying, in the middle of sort of the worst investment meltdown, here comes the de-extinction company raising, money at a $1.4 billion pre-money, and their mouth just drops. And it's like, what in the world is their business model? So let's jump into that, because to raise capital, and you need something exciting, you need a massive transformative purpose, you need a great team, and you need a good business model or a great business model. So what is it?
Yeah, so we kind of have like two parts of the business model. One is all about, we're huge believers in option value, right? And so we believe that, very similar to the Apollo program, on the path to the de-extinction of mammoths and thylacines and dodos and maybe other species, we will build technologies that have an application not just for conservation, but for human healthcare. And so that innovation creates a massive kind of option value for our investors, right? Because like Bold and all our incredible investors out there, when we create those technologies and we spin them out of the company, all of our shareholders get their appropriate shares in that spin out. We did that last year with 4Bio, which is our first computational biology software platform. We didn't have all the tools we really needed to do this. We went and built them, and then we realized that has application in other places. And we raised an oversubscribed $30 million round, for that business, which was amazing. That Kent Wakeford, CEO of that's just absolutely crushing it, and Kent as well. And they're doing quite well. They're doing mid 7 figures in ARR already, which is just, in this market, like for a software company that just started, is incredible. They just announced a major partnership with Google, and so the first part of our business model is really in the technologies, right? Like, how do we build? We've got about 36 patents in process, and we've got another spin out on the horizon. Probably won't be this year, probably be early next year, but we've got what we think is our next really strong advancement. But any of these advancements, any of these spin outs and this option value could be multi-billion-dollar companies in themselves, right? And I think that we'll probably have 10 plus spin outs, or potentially more over the life of our company.
Which, by the way, as an entrepreneur sort of studying this, it's an interesting approach that a lot of individuals don't take. Typically, you retain that inside the company, make it a division of your company, hire a president to run it. And it's great, right? The investors love you for this because it allows you to focus on the primary purpose of what you built Colossal for, and gives this incredible optionality adjacency for everybody else, and doesn't take your eye off the ball. So great idea for other entrepreneurs to be.
No, we needed this tech anyway, right? Now there's other tech that we built that's amazing that we don't think has a marketability, outside of what we're using it for. So we're not going to go spin those out, right? Like, we're not going to just spin out everything we make. So there's a lot of intentionality to creating that option value that's meaningful, right? And then the second part of our business is around education and partnerships. And so we mentioned obviously Thomas and others. We're working on a big entertainment partnership around the docuseries, letting educational content around that docuseries. We want to chronicle this for the world, and media and entertainment does make money. And what's interesting about that aspect of the business is that it's starting to lead us into conversations with governments, where we're in the middle of, I can't say who yet, who, but we're in the middle of closing a very large 8-figure and a separate 9-figure contract.
We can say it's on planet Earth. We can say
it is. It is on planet Earth, where governments are, while we want to open source all of the technologies for conservation, some governments have some critically endangered issues, and need us to help them preserve their keystone species that's very important to their cultures. And so, we are working on 2 very large deals that have very large price tags to them, but are still massively, they are a massive accelerant to these countries' biodiversity restoration programs. In one case, we're cutting down a country's work by 20 years and saving them hundreds of millions of dollars. And so when you can show that you can create that value for countries and allow them to preserve their animals on that scale, as well as they can save their conservation, the budgets of conservation, hundreds of millions of dollars that can be then applied in other and potentially better ways and cut decades off their rewilding timelines. It's a value prop that, one of the negative criticisms we've got at launch was you're taking money away from conservation. And it's like, no, first of all, we're bringing new money and new technologies to conservation, and we're going to show the world that you can actually do really smart, innovative ways of using technology in select cases of conservation that shortens timelines by decades and saves hundreds of millions of dollars.
So you can actually help governments take a number of their species that are on the edge of going extinct and to help bring back those populations. One of the things I find amazing when we first discussed it, I said, well, okay, I understand how you go to get a embryo or a single cell of a thylacine or a dodo, but how do you grow it into the whole animal? Where do you incubate it? And I have to say, you don't consider this an independent moonshot, but I think the idea of the end point here of ultimately an artificial womb is an amazing, moonshot into itself. So what are you doing in the near terms? Where do you incubate the embryo for 22 months for a woolly mammoth?
So it's weird is I'm so close to the science and the teams. I live and breathe and stay in the labs most days when I'm not traveling. And so what's weird to me, and I love that you brought this up, is that de-extinction no longer to me seems like a moonshot. Because I'm just so close. I know where we are and I know how fast some things are coming. And so it just doesn't seem like a moonshot anymore based on where we are, right? And what the tangible progress that we see on a quarter-over-quarter basis. What's interesting to me is what I do think is still as a moonshot is our artificial womb or ex utero development. And I'm at with the ex utero development teams. We found that people resonated better with that than artificial wombs, but they're the same. And I'm actually sitting in our office, in my office that's at the ex utero development lab. So I'm spending a lot of time now on that, given that the de-extinction side of the business is very, I feel like has all the right people enrolling. I'm spending a lot of time on ex utero development systems now for the artificial womb. And what's interesting is all of the animals, our first generation of animals, will all be born through surrogacy. So that's why we have the big animal husbandry group. So we don't need artificial wombs to be successful in thylacines.
So slow that down. Slow it down a second. So for a woolly mammoth, you're going to have made these edits in some 60 or 70 loci, whether it's a gene replacement or a CRISPR edit or whatever it might be, and you've got a single effectively fertilized cell of a woolly mammoth-like species. And you probably have a number of these, right? You've probably done this in vitro, hundreds of them. Like when you have a surrogate child and you do in vitro fertilization, and in this case, who is the surrogate?
So 2 things that you brought up that I think are really interesting. I think that we will shock people in the next year with some of our successful IVF and cloning numbers. Cloning historically, and that's the somatic cell nuclear transfer part, and then the acceptance through in vitro
somatic cell nuclear transfer. So this is a somatic cell is a body cell versus your gametes versus your
your germ cells. Exactly.
And nuclear transfer is taking the nucleus out and putting it into a different cell.
And to put it into one of those egg cells, right?
Yes.
And we've had a couple really interesting breakthroughs that we will be announcing in the not too distant future that increase the efficiency of that over 25x of what's out there, which is incredible. And so to that process, we are going to be using Asian elephants as our surrogates for the mammoth. We'll be using, this is interesting about the thylacine, and we'll come back to artificial wombs here in a second. But with the thylacine, we're using the closest phylogenetic relative in that desiurid family is actually the fat-tailed dunnart. It's like a marsupial mouse. It's like this big. And so it's funny, people are like, wait, you're telling me a wolf-size animal is going to come from this? But they're younger, the same size. They're both the size. When they're born after that 13 and a half days gestation, they're about the size of a grain of rice. And most marsupials gestate mostly outside of the womb. So that leads to other challenges that we're working on, like exopouches. And yeah, exactly. But our goal, though, is long-term. We want our system, we want ex utero development or artificial wombs that we can grow 1,000 mammoths, right? Because we won't be able to grow 1,000 mammoths, the old-fashioned way, right? And so being able to do that for not just mammoths, but imagine a world, Peter, where we are down. We have 100x. We're down 100x right now on number of species or number of blue whale individuals in the ocean. Imagine a world where we can work with governments to grow, where you have these football-size, systems where you can grow, 100 blue whales for reintroduction. So we think that
for the rhino, for lions,
the northern white rhinos, for anything, right? It's like work with let's let conservationists and rewilding partners work to do the hard work of reintroducing the species and socializing and herd dynamics and all that incredible work that they do. But the gestation, let's grow them all ex utero. And so I actually believe that the artificial womb has a more potential for impact to the world, even than our de-extinction work. And so we have a 17-person team working on the ex utero development systems here. We also have a partnership with the University of Melbourne outside of our thylacine partnership that's working on it. And then we fund people in George's lab that's working on it. So it's a combined team of probably about 25, 26 people that are working on artificial wombs here at Colossal that we want to be able to grow everything in.
Is this an artificial womb that will take a embryo from single cell through to surviving on its own? So it really is the work of the science fiction stories of a real artificial womb.
It's a true artificial womb. Like Alan Flake, for example, who's an incredible mind. He doesn't work with Colossal. He's amazing. He's done. He did the biobag Lamm work back in 2015.
I remember
and
that.
He's very focused on later stage. For
preemies.
For preemies, exactly. Right. And they do a microsurgery in the umbilicus and whatnot. And that's great. For that use case, it's incredible. And he is the world's best at it. But what we really want to do is we don't want to be doing, if you want to grow 1,000 animals, we don't want to be doing a lot of microsurgeries in that umbilicus. So really being able to build a artificial placenta, an artificial kind of this endometrial layer of the uterine wall that a placenta can invade and connect to. Yeah. Now the beautiful thing for us. Well, here's the beautiful thing about it, though, is that while there's varying different placental types, I didn't know that. I thought everything just threw in a bag inside of another bag, right? Before I started this, but there's actually different placental types, right? And what's interesting is that comes from the embryo. And so the embryo basically makes the organ that invades this uterine wall. So we really have to get right the gas exchange and the as well as nutrient and excrement exchange through kind of this system. I know Doris Taylor. We're working with her on decellularized membranes. So it's really kind of interesting because we're bringing all these different people like Doris together to think through how you could build these membranes through synthetic biology that a embryo would want the placenta to invade into, right? So that it's as natural as possible.
Hey everybody, this is Peter. A quick break from the episode. I'm a firm believer that science and technology and how entrepreneurs can change the world is the only real news out there worth consuming. I don't watch the crisis news network I call CNN or Fox and hear every devastating piece of news on the planet. I spend my time training my neural net, the way I see the world, by looking at the incredible breakthroughs in science and technology, how entrepreneurs are solving the world's grand challenges, what the breakthroughs are in longevity, how exponential technologies are transforming our world. So twice a week, I put out a blog. One blog is looking at the future of longevity, age reversal, biotech, increasing your health span. The other blog looks at exponential technologies, AI, 3D printing, synthetic biology, AR, VR, blockchain. These technologies are transforming what you as an entrepreneur can do. If this is the kind of news you want to learn about and shape your neural nets with, go to Diamandis.com/blog and learn more. Now back to the episode. I can't help but ask some timelines here. You said that the woolly mammoth is 2028. We're recording this in third quarter, entering third quarter of 2023. So 5 years out. Can you give us timelines on the dodo and the thylacine?
Yeah, so the thylacine, I would assume that you would see it sooner, given that it's a
12 days.
A 13 and a half day gestation. So there's a higher probability of that. In the dodo, what's really interesting about the dodo is it's about a 30-day gestation, right? And we're using these sterile chickens. This to me is crazy this is the kind of stuff that you learn about biology that you're like, wait, what? That to me sounds like science fiction. But you can actually take edited primordial germ cells of it. They've done this experiment where they've edited these things called primordial germ cells that are found in birds. And they take these primordial germ cells of ducks, insert them into that of a sterile chicken. The sterile chickens mate, an egg is laid, it hatches, and it's a duck. Like that to me, I know that sounds like we talk about de-extinction. I kind of like, oh yeah, that's fine. We got that. That to me is the stuff that just seems like, wait, I still have a hard time doing it. So we have an entire avian genomics group now that's focused on cultivating these primordial germ cells, which is very, very difficult. And the closest living relative to the dodo is the actually Nicobar pigeon, which is beautiful. Looks nothing like what we think the dodo look like. And so if we can get those primordial germ cells completed in stable and in growing in culture at the right scale fast, then I think the dodo, could be in the next couple years. That's really the rate limiting factor is now if it takes us 2 years to do that, then I think it'd be, 2026.
Would you bet on the Tasmanian tiger before the dodo?
You just have this variable. You have this massive variable in the primordial germ cells. If the PGC stuff works, I'd bet on the dodo first.
All right. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to tell me what's next, but I am going to ask you to tell me.
I told you about mammoth style. Yeah.
Order of magnitude. How many species have you been dreaming about? Are there dozens or hundreds of species that could be on the de-extinction list?
I think for us, there will be a handful, I think, over time for us.
So you open source the technology for others to play with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that for conservation purposes, right? Like I do think that I think de-extinction is something that needs to be measured and thought out well of like what's the intention of it and why are you doing it. And remember, all the species that we're working on, we want to rewild. So we're working with local governments. In some cases, that's foreign governments. We're working with indigenous people groups. We're working with private landowners. So there's a lot of people that go into this outside of just the Colossal team, right? So you really need to collaborate and whatnot. So we are going to open source all the technologies that have an application to conservation for conservation purposes. There will be some de-extinction tech that we just don't open source because we just think that maybe not everyone should have that.
Okay, now let's get to the top secret part of this episode. A billionaire comes to you and says, listen, Ben, I want to bring back the dinosaurs, or at least a dinosaur. This is something I truly want to do. I want to demonstrate it's possible for scientific purposes. We're not going to rewild with these guys. And you say to them, no? You say it's impossible? Come on, give up here. What's possible here?
So
I mean, a chicken is kind of a dinosaur in one sense.
Yeah, birds are just generally scary. So I don't know. I think that birds are dinosaurs. Like Kenneth Lacavara, arguably number one paleontologist in the world, was one of our advisors. He's like, dinosaurs are around us, and so they're birds. They're the dinosaurs that made it. And so I have been asked that question, not once. That's a theme that we get. It was just the 30th anniversary of Jurassic Park. So you can believe the number of calls, press, everything that asks us about dinosaurs. So it is impossible to bring back a dinosaur. And I always break people's hearts when I say that, because right now, from a technology perspective, we can go back, a million or so years in terms of like that ancient DNA. But the problem is, unless you find some frozen dinosaur or some dinosaur that was just so well preserved in a cave that hasn't fossilized, you're not going to get any DNA. Now, what you could do, which I think is interesting, is I do think that you can do ancestral reconstructions through computational analysis of early dinosaur-like birds. I think that is a possibility in terms of like computational analysis. It's also possible to demineralize dinosaur bones to get amino acids, but you're not going to get even small fragments of DNA, right?
Sure.
So I do think that from a technological perspective, humanity will have the ability to do ancestral state reconstructions of early birds or early mammals, but we will not be able to de-extinct a dinosaur. And I think those technologies could be applied in better ways. Like, how do we make more drought? How do we make more drought resistant animals or crops? How do we I think growing 100 blue whales at the same time, or 1,000, will have more meaningful impact. And I think it's as hard as engineering a precursor to birds.
Okay, well, I'll have to break the news to my 12-year-olds, but we'll.
Yeah.
Let's go back, my friend. So we're talking to entrepreneurs here about moonshots, and I want to hit on 2 points. For those who are dreaming big dreams and want to go and make a dent in the universe and go and do something. Because I think you said it really beautifully in the beginning. This is my shot of doing something significant in life. And if I don't take it, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror and say, you could have and you didn't. So let's talk about that. And let's talk about the importance of having what is it that allows you to feel the confidence to take it on in a field that isn't yours? And then the third thing I want to talk about is, how in the world do you raise money for something like this? Like, I want to talk about those early conversations, because no bucks, no Buck Rogers. So take it from there.
Yeah, I think that, I'll start with the raising capital side, and we'll go from there. We were very mindful in terms of who we approached, right? Now, after we started raising capital and we went public with the news that we're working on this, we did have a lot of conversations because people were like super interested. And look, we got a lot of no's. In any deal that I've ever done, I have yet to have the experience where you just walk in and someone's like, I love that idea. Here's a term sheet that's blank with as much money as you want at whatever price and whatever terms. I've yet to see that deal. I hear stories in the movies of those deals, like that the Silicon Valley napkin on a Sunday night before the partner meeting. Yeah, I've heard those stories too. I've never experienced them, so maybe I'm just not good. But really being intentional that we had to align this project with people like you, with people like Thomas Toll, people like Jim Breyer and Tim Draper. These are all people that think to use your words, that think in abundance, that want to advance humanity, that have all made a ton of money, and they're not just doing it for the money. They want to make money and return money to their shareholders, but at the same time, they want to push all of humanity forward, right? And so we were very thoughtful on who we went to and why. And
who is who in the early days? I mean, George is on as the scientific advisor. What term did you use for George in the early days?
Well, I just said co-founder, and then
that's fair enough.
Yeah, and so I said co-founder. But what's interesting is that because George, to your point, has done a lot of companies, people were like, "Oh, but he's not working on too many things." It's like, yeah, but ask him. If you know him, ask him. And when several people reached out to him, he's like, "Oh yeah, he's like, I love all the projects I'm working on, but this one, you could hear in his voice how he felt about it. I mean, you've talked about this. It's like you could hear the difference in his voice on this one. And so it was me. It was Andrew who we'd started a handful of companies together. He's been a great product guy. And
Andrew's been part of your team over years.
Been really leading.
You guys have a great track record together.
Great track record. Kent Wakeford, right? And Kent moved across country to help me get this thing started.
But of course, Andrew and Kent, neither of them had sort of this biological background.
I know. We had zero. I reached out to, I was fortunate enough to win Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year a few years ago, and I met Joe DeSimone, who's incredible, who did Carbon 3D, and he's an amazing entrepreneur. And if you haven't talked to him, you should talk to him. He's amazing. I love Joe. And I got connected to him through the EY network, so I was like, I'll talk to him. So I started having a couple of these like individual science conversations, and they were like, we would love to work with George on this. We'd love to advise you on who you should hire, and we'd love to be on your scientific advisory board. So we had very early success even though we had zero people internally on the science team, we had very early success on the scientific advisory board to help guide us. And then George said, hey, one of my postdocs is being poached to go do venture capital. I think that she would this is what she wants to do. This is Ariana, who you've met, spent time with. And he's like, this is what she wants to do more than anything. And if she really has the opportunity, I think she'll succeed and be the bridge between Harvard and Colossal. And so I had one meeting with her, and I don't think I've ever told Ariana this, so I should tell her this about how amazing it was. I remember like hanging up the phone or the Zoom with her, and I was in Omaha, Nebraska when I Zoomed, and I called our other scientist, Sarah Ord, who had worked with me before and consulted with me at Hypergiant and whatnot, and she was our only other scientist, and I was like, oh my gosh, we have someone from the church lab, and we have two scientists now. And I was like so ecstatic, right? Because we had one from Harvard, one from Johns Hopkins. I was like, those are good, like we got this, right? And Ariana was a really great moment when we were like, oh my gosh, we can recruit scientists to this. We knew we could get advisors to it, but could we recruit actual scientists that wouldn't go pursue a drug? And it was like 8 people. I remember when Kent moved to Dallas to help us get started, and we were in one of my other company's offices, and we were sitting there with Dave Copps from Worlds. We were sitting there at Dave's in Worlds offices, and Kent and I were looking around. It's like, so it's us. Let's go. But those are the fun days when you have a blank piece of paper.
They are. I remember those days. I think I came on as an advisor just about that point, and then introduced you to Bold and a few other funds. What was the first capital you brought in? Was it a convertible note? Was it your own money? Was it a first seed investor?
So I spent, and I do this with all of the companies I go work on, and I never ask for terms on it. I know a lot of people ask for terms on it. I don't, though. So I spent a little over, I spent low 7 figures on this from my pocket, just for, before we started in 2021, talking to people, traveling, hiring external scientists. Like, I am a somewhat trust but verify guy. And so, I trusted George, but I was like, is it as close as he says and whatnot? So I spent that capital on my own dime. And then like kind of doing that research. And then, some of the first money in was, Thomas Tull, Bold, Jazz Ventures, Tim Draper, what's interesting. And then Tom Chi, like I remember Tom Chi was the biggest check in the seed, and Tom Chi got it. And I was like, you have these pivotal moments on your journey where, our first conversation where you were like, you need to go do this. Like you were very inspiring to me. Like, and this is before you even introduced me to the Bolt team. You were like, you need to go do this. How can I help? And so you were a major inflection point, which I really appreciate. When I talked to Animal Capital, I was late. I'd been told no a handful of times. I was exhausted. It was like a 9 p.m. call. Talked to Marshall, and Marshall's like, yes, we're in. We're in right now. I'll wire you $250,000 tomorrow. And I was like, that was an inflection point, because that was very early before we had Ariona or whatnot. And then Tim Draper, which he came on and he came in and wrote $1 million check. And then when I talked to Tom Chi, Tom was like, he totally got it. His fund At One is so focused on impact.
And Tom, by the way, a co-founder of Google X with Astro on the team there.
He's just, as you know, he's just amazing and thoughtful. He understood the science, and he was like, we'll take the rest of the round. And I was like, amazing, right? And so, because I felt like we were too early almost for the big traditional funds. And so we raised all of it on a convertible note with a cap. So we raised at the time $8 million with Thomas kind of rounding that out, and then. We then raised another 8 on a uncapped note, which, if you can get it. And Thomas was the one that said, you need more money. And so Thomas would have put more money in. We filled out that remaining. We launched with 16 million. And within a week, we were getting term sheets from funds that wanted to put in 40 million and do an A. And so that happened very quickly. I called Tom Chi, called you, called Thomas Toll, and Thomas is like, none of us got the consistent message we got. Journals like, none of us got as much as we wanted in the seed, and so they're like, we'll give you a term sheet. And so we ended up raising 60 versus 40, and we brought in new partners, which was great, but a lot of obviously our early team.
It's a beautiful startup story, and I love the fact that you made the commitment yourself with your own capital, which if you're able to do it as an entrepreneur, it's a show of success, a show of commitment beyond just your time, that your team from previous ventures continued to join you, that George's right-hand person joined the team. So there's the formulation, the scientific advisory board, but it was doing this also at a very difficult time to raise capital, just for contextual period. What's your advice for entrepreneurs looking to take on a moonshot? Any big takeaways? Someone who wants to.
A couple big takeaways for me are I did have a little bit of I have a proven track record. I did get more no's than I anticipated, because I was like, how can you guys not want to do this, right? This is incredibly valuable for the world. It's like if you could go back to like the 60s, right? Like if you could offer someone a time machine and go back to the 60s and be like, hey, would you want to invest in NASA, which I would argue is, regardless of how you feel about America worldwide or politics or aside or whatever, NASA is the number one brand that came out of America. Everyone supports NASA. Like, it is the brand. And it's like, if you could invest in NASA, why wouldn't you invest in NASA? Like, it's crazy. It is an absolutely no-brainer. And so I will say that it was a little bit struggling that we did get no's, because I was shocked. I mean, not surprised, given we had so very little at the beginning. But still, I was like, we have a really smart team. Kent had taken companies public, sold companies for billions of dollars. Me and Andrew had done quite well. So it's like, I feel like we had stuff that like people would get behind. But I'd say if you're going to do a moonshot, you have to be even thicker skinned. And I think going through the process, not of successfully building startups, but I've been told no so many more times before I started Colossal that I was so used to being told no that it just didn't really affect me. I had the conviction. And so you have to, you can't go talk to 2 people or 5 people and be told no 4 times and be like, I can't do this. I've been told probably no 1,000 times.
Team, tech, or capital. So, if you have all 3, you're all set. sounds like you came in first with team.
Yep.
And
then capital,
yeah.
and then bet on George on the tech.
Yeah. And is that what you would recommend for moonshots?
I just think I think it's team and conviction is just so important, right? Like, George has this saying where he doesn't let anyone in his lab use the word impossible. He's like, we may not understand how to do it yet, but I won't use the word impossible. And he doesn't allow it in his lab. And I think that it was inspiring to start the company with George, because George was so happy when we raised $8 million.
I know.
And he was like,
come on, it was like orders of magnitude more than he'd done before.
Yeah, he was ecstatic. He's like, are you serious? Like, he was so excited.
Are you guys playing with, large language models, or what's coming in AI in the work that we're doing?
Yeah, so we are. So on the large language model piece, we have outside of Form Bio, we have a genotype to phenotype team, and it's really helpful for literature review, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that comes out. Obviously, some of these things are gated in time, so it doesn't help with some of the most recent articles that have come out. But it does help with reviewing peer-reviewed papers, making summaries for onboarding and whatnot. So we are using ChatGPT and several of the other large language models out there. We're also using some of the generative AI tools out there to talk about, like, we have an idea for this like educational experience that we're working on. And, instead of going and copying it up, we're using some of the generative tools there. So, yeah. Outside of the models that we're building for, like, we have a tool that's pretty cool internally that actually makes recommendations of what tool sets that will create to use for each edit that has the least likelihood of off targets. And like, that's insanely valuable, right? So.
All right. Last subject I want to get into here before I ask you what your XPRIZE should be. Let's talk about the morals and ethics. I have to imagine you get a lot of people sort of raising their hands and saying, come on. You're playing God. How can you find this morally acceptable? What's the ethics involved here? Aren't people going to use this technology, not to bring back extinct species, but to sort of like come up with, glow in the dark cats and, cats with horns and a whole slew of mix and match. And it's a lot of. I remember when I was at the Whitehead Institute at MIT as an undergrad. The early days of genetic engineering, and the conversation was all around these restriction enzymes are going to allow us to reinvent species and come up with things, and a lot of debate and discussion about the ethics and morality. Now it's calmed down. It's come back now with AI. But have you reignited that? Are you getting a lot of people concerned about this going out of bounds?
Well, AI, synthetic biology, it's hard to put, CRISPR, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle on some of these things, right? And so we work very closely with the federal government, and we've been public about our investment from In-Q-Tel and whatnot. And so we want to be part of the teams that helps think through like what should be used and why, and where do we draw boundaries around it. I think that we've been very fortunate with people like Alta Charo and others. Alta is one of the world's leading bioethicists who joined our team. And we've been very fortunate to pull together not just scientists and bioethicists, but also conservation groups. We partner with all the top conservation groups and we've really listened. And I think I have a different perspective now than I did maybe 10 years ago on critics and kind of like including ethical critics. And, I think you can learn a lot from an informed critic, right? Like, they are the subject matter expert. They don't have to share your belief. And we've taken this attitude that it's not our job to persuade anyone. It's our job to educate people and be transparent about what we're doing. And so that's what we, strive to do. And then we really try to listen to those feedback. And some of our earliest critics have become our most valuable assets. And, like Lou Vidal, he was pretty negative when we came out. And now we could not be where we are on the Mammoth project without him.
Yeah. I have to point out the human brain is incredible at imagining all of the terrible things that can happen as a result of some technologies. I mean, we have been trained by Hollywood and the Crisis News Network to always go dystopian all the time. And it's just, it makes billion-dollar blockbusters. But we don't think about what would happen if the technology didn't come into existence, right? I mean, this is the technology that can bring back extinct animals and maintain, large breeding herds for animals on the bridge, on the precipice of extinction.
You brought up a good point there. You know me, and I'm an eternal optimist, so I don't think as much about.
By the way, optimists live an average of 15 years longer than pessimists. So go.
Well, good. So that's going to take me from like 400 to 415. So that's great. So I'm excited about that. That's great. That's great data. And so, but what's interesting is that but for the dystopian, because even if you talk through it and you understand the ethical applications, because I would argue we play God every day. Like we eradicated the dodo, we eradicated the thylacine. We had a hand in, or early man had a hand in eradicating the mammoths, right? And when we chop down a forest or pollute our rivers or take medicines, we play God every day, even with our own bodies. So I think that this is an opportunity to not only undo the sins of the past, but fundamentally for that dystopian crowd, I believe that hopefully it doesn't get to this point, but wouldn't we want a de-extinction toolkit, and wouldn't we want the capabilities to bring back at least keystone species that are fundamental to ecosystems, which are fundamental to things like food security? So in the event that we do lose all species, isn't it better? We can all say that we just want to preserve life, which is great, but in the event that we had to bring stuff back, isn't it better that we have that capability set for those? I don't believe in that world, but for the dystopians of the world, I think it is better that we have that tool, those capabilities, and that knowledge base, because we are losing species at an alarming rate, and in the event, having the tools to bring them back is better than not.
Beautifully said. All right, Ben, here we go. It's a few years from now. I'm done so incredibly well on my colossal investment that I'm like, I want to say thank you, Ben. I want to fund a Ben Lamm XPRIZE. What is an XPRIZE that you want to inspire entrepreneurs around the world to go morning through night to go and solve? Do you have one?
Yes, I do, and I don't think I'll get to it, but hopefully, and hopefully, I would love, if someone does it, I'd love to advise it. But, I think that Elon is doing an incredible job of recognizing that we have to extend consciousness into the universe and become an interplanetary species. And I think that's amazing. And I'm, full disclosure, I'm a SpaceX investor. I'm a huge fan, supporter. But interestingly enough, most of the world is covered by water, right? And I think that there's an opportunity when we start to think about like sustainability in these closed ecosystems that we are going to have to do for off-world. I'd love to see that happen here also in parallel to extending life interplanetary, is I'd like to see that happen here in the oceans, right? It's like, you've got these like little, hotels that have like the rooms underwater, but it's like we should have the technologies where we can colonize, which will force us to build closed systems, right? Where we have to focus on
life support.
Life support systems. Also, we have to be more thoughtful about food, sustainability. So I'd love to build sustainable underwater cities. I think that, that will make us appreciate our oceans more. If you have reefs and fish outside and kelp outside versus plastic. So I would love to see an XPRIZE on building not an underwater hotel, but a sustainable underwater city.
How big a population?
I mean, we don't have to
put some numbers on this.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that you need a small town. I think you need like 10,000 people.
Wow.
I mean, I'm in real cities, like real, like eventually metropolitan cities. But yeah, I know that's not going to start there, but I mean, that would be the goal. It's like, how do you get to a 5,000 person sustainable city? Not like 50 or 100, like a real city.
Ben, I can honestly say it is always an incredible pleasure when I get your phone calls. And Peter, do you have a second? and the updates I get from you are amazing. Where on the planet you are when you call me, it's sort of Russian roulette. You are an example of what an amazing CEO can do. I just want to say thank you on behalf of Bold, myself, George Church, and humanity as you bring these technologies to bear. I mean, everything from the artificial womb to helping rewild extinct species to actually bringing species back from the precipice of extinction. That's amazing work.
Thank you.
Thank you, buddy.
Appreciate you.
Take care.